Coming up on this edition of the Climate Show, we talk about the hockey stick here in Australasia and proof that things really have been heating up in the past 50 years. What else we got, Gareth?
We're going to be looking at methane coming out of the ground in the Arctic. We're going to be looking also at the West Antarctic ice sheet and possibility of instabilities there.
And also John Cook looks to shoot some cherry pickers and a whole lot more. That's coming up on this edition of The Climate Show. This episode of The Climate Show is brought to you by hot-topic.co.nz, cyblogs.co.nz, skepticalscience.com, scoop.co.nz, idealog.co.nz and Kiwi FM.
Drop in the ocean. What good is a drop in the ocean?
Hello and welcome along to episode number 27 of The Climate Show, a show all about climate change. That is the science, the policy, the politics, the solutions and also the skeptics as well. It's a podcast in video and audio form. I'm one of the co-hosts. My name is Glenn Williams, recording here in Auckland City, perhaps for the last time in Auckland City. And my co-host is Gareth Ronaldo in Waipara, North Canterbury of New Zealand, joining us today. Hello to you, Gareth.
Hello there, Glenn. Yes, and a very beautiful day here. So we're sort of descending into winter with frost in the mornings and logs on the fire and extra layers of coverage.
Yes, it's certainly like that here in Auckland as well. I think we have one of the coldest mornings of the year so far. But that's, I guess, a good thing for Northern Hemisphere listeners and viewers who will be enjoying the fruits of summer very soon as well, no doubt.
They will, and they'll be enjoying your company too, as your rather little mention there suggested.
Yeah. So I'm going to be making the move to London in June, towards the end of June. Sort of picking up life and taking it on the road, I suppose. Something I always wanted to do was check out Europe, and if I'm not going to do it now, then when am I going to do it? So thought I'd quit everything here and head over there, but not quit everything completely. With a show like this, of course, it can be done anywhere in the world. It's all via Skype and whatnot. Doesn't matter where I am or where Gareth is or where John is or where our guests are. So we're going to make sure that we continue, but there probably will be a big sort of gap there in the middle while I get a new studio system set up, but certainly going to keep it going.
Yes, absolutely. It's not many people who say that their great European adventures are going to start in Croydon, though.
You're not supposed to mention that.
Anyway, the Climate Show will continue, and instead of spanning 2 continents, we'll be spanning 3 and the entire globe.
Yeah.
So if Microsoft are listening, please can you make sure that Skype works properly?
Yes, now that they are meant to be in control of that technology. But anyway, we've got a good show lined up of lots of news that's happened over the past 3 weeks, and particularly a very interesting study for the this part of the world, Australasia. Also, John is along. What's John going to be talking about today, Gareth?
Well, I think he's going to be looking at how skeptics basically lie about temperature reconstructions. Okay,
and we've got a few flash new graphs to go with that. Plus, we've got some solutions towards the end of the show. But just a reminder before we get into it that you can subscribe to the audio version on iTunes or in your RSS player, perhaps on the Stitcher mobile app as well, which is a great way to listen to all kinds of podcasts and internet radio from around the world. Plus, there's the video version. If you're listening to the audio and you want to see anything that we're talking about, then you can in video form on YouTube, and that's up at theclimateshow.com and hot-topic.co.nz. Well, let's get stuck into it. And first up, that study that I was just talking about, the hockey stick study, as it's also being called. Scientists from the University of Melbourne have used 27 natural climate records, including tree rings, corals, and ice cores, to create the first large-scale temperature reconstruction for the region over the past 1,000 years. And they're really getting a good picture of that massive temperature increase in the last 50 years in Australia and New Zealand, Gareth.
Yeah, this is, if you like, very robust information that we've got our own regional hockey stick, and that is evidence, paleoclimate evidence, that the recent past has been hotter than at any time in the last 1,000 years. Now, the famous hockey stick, the one that's been sort of controversial, is usually a northern hemisphere hockey stick that was first produced by Michael Mann back in the 1990s. This latest paper uses, as you said, 27 local records. Those are tree rings from New Zealand and Tasmania, corals from around Australia and the Southwest Pacific, and also a ice core from Antarctica, and then plugs that information into climate models and uses them to reconstruct the climate over the 1,000 years. And that produces, as you might expect, a hockey stick graph. Now, if you can pop that graph, figure 5, up on the screen, we can have a look at what that means. If you look back through the last 1,000 years, you've basically got a lot of ups and downs, but particular obvious trend, except possibly just to my eyeball, a sort of gentle cooling towards the middle of the, well, from the 1200s through to the middle of the 1800s. And then you've got that rather obvious and clear uptick at the end. The grey bars around the black line in the middle of the uncertainty associated, and there are the pink bands are periods when the sun was at relatively low activity period, and those don't seem to show any clear correlation with the sort of overall temperatures in the southern hemisphere. So what you've got basically is a reconstruction. It's a relatively flat blade with a definite uptick at the hockey stick end of things. It's a sort of powerful confirmation of the information that people studying in Australia and New Zealand already felt, and that was that we were anomalously warm end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st. But this is the most, if you like, the most thorough reconstruction and wide-ranging reconstruction. Confirms it all rather nicely.
Yes, indeed it does, and it's gotten a bit of media attention both here in New Zealand and Australia as well. The mainstream media seem to be captivated by this particular piece of research rather than any other in the last wee while. So that's interesting in itself, I suppose. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's commonplace in the New Zealand media anyway to kind of just go with the big global picture, and we are really only a small part of that big picture. So when somebody comes along and does a big regional reconstruction like this, it's interesting.
And talking about the regional representation, we've got a map on screen right now of the Australasian region, and it's got the blue and green dots, and those represent exactly where the samples were taken.
Yeah, exactly. This is all pre-existing data that the authors of the current paper have kind of pulled together and used to make their long series. So the green dots are the mainly tree ring series. A lot of them from about 8, I think, from New Zealand, from the far north to the south. 3 tree ring series from Tasmania.
There would have been kauri rings in the north, wouldn't they?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure what's the... you can go through the paper and dig out all the details, but yes. And then the blue rings from the coral sequences from Western Australia up through Indonesia and towards the Philippines, the Coral Sea, down Papua New Guinea, out to, I guess that's Niue, is it, out there?
Yeah.
Rarotonga or Fiji.
Yeah.
So basically, that they kind of define the region. Data from all over. It's
amazing though. Throughout most of Australia, of course, you really can't sample anything apart from Tasmania because it's just desert and there's not a whole heck of a lot there to sample.
Yeah, well, it must be a bit difficult if you're in the middle of the Australian desert to work out what a paleoclimate proxy might be. But yeah, I'm no expert on Australian paleoclimate, so I can't tell you why they haven't got anything from Queensland or the rainforests of the far north, but possibly because those trees don't provide the right variability in them, perhaps, to provide a decent record.
Okay, moving along. This is one of the things that's been worrying us for a wee while now, that methane held underneath underground by caps of Arctic ice is bubbling out as warming climate causes those caps to melt, and researchers have been looking at this recently, and it's been featured in the New York Times.
Yes, indeed. This particular story did the rounds. It was on the New York Times. It was on the BBC. And it's basically a researcher called Katie Walter Anthony. She used to be just plain Katie Walter until she got married. And Katie Walter specialized in studying methane that kind of bubbles up from lake beds and gets trapped under the ice. And the New York Times starts with a picture of her on a frozen lake, examining where the methane has been bubbling out. And what Walter Anthony has done, she's from the University of Alaska at Fairbanks, and she has been looking at the sources of methane coming up from the edges of melting permafrost and glaciers. So this isn't necessarily a source of methane, but what they're doing is finding out where the methane that's actually in the air is coming from. And this is related to the retreat of the land ice and the retreat of the permafrost. So this is something different to the methane that, say, exists under the permafrost or in the permafrost itself in other areas. This is being released all the time and has probably been released fairly steadily since the end of the last ice age as the ice has retreated. So it's not the same as as the large amounts of methane that exist, for instance, under the East Siberian shelf on the ocean off Siberia. So it's an interesting paper because what it shows is that the researchers are beginning to get a handle on what's going on with the kind of methane budget of the atmosphere. They're beginning to find out which bits are contributing to the recent increase, because there has been a recent increase. There'd been a major increase over the 20th century, which had sort of begun to level out into the first few years of this, but has since there's been an uptick, and there's been suggestions that this has been coming from Arctic methane sources. There isn't enough evidence to actually be about that, but the sort of work that Katie Walter Anthony is doing is trying to sort of find out what the various contributions to that methane budget might be, where they're all coming from. So what her paper's been looking at is a type of methane deposit known as geologic reservoir. So the methane's been trapped underground for a very long time, thousands, perhaps even millions of years, and it's kind of old gas that comes out as the ice retreats. So yeah, interesting stuff. And it's, we've seen the uptick in methane. We see the Arctic. We notice that the Arctic is beginning to melt, and yeah, it's a fairly obvious conclusion to draw that there's a risk that this stuff could get seriously worse as time goes.
Yeah, indeed. Well, let's head to the opposite end of the world, to the West Antarctic ice sheet, where there's some potential instability being discovered there.
Yes, it's interesting. Most of the focus on West Antarctic ice sheet has been on the Pine Island Glacier and the Thwaites Glacier. Those are big glaciers that flow Amundsen Sea, which is sort of, if you carry on going around from the Ross Ice Shelf and New Zealand's base at McMurdo, you eventually, after several thousand kilometres, get towards the Pine Island Glacier. It's sort of between the Ross Ice Shelf and the Antarctic Peninsula. Well, on the other side of the Antarctic Peninsula, it's a different sea. It's the Weddell Sea, and there's a large ice shelf which is called the Filchner-Ronne ice shelf. And where that hits the main kind of ice coverage of West Antarctica. There we are. You found the map on the page. You hit the ice streams coming off the main body of the West Antarctica. This particular team, people from the British Antarctic Survey, but also involving the University of Texas at Austin and quite a few others, did a survey which shows that there's a large kind of underwater basin that lies underneath these glaciers. And so there's a mechanism there for warming waters to get under these glaciers and to destabilize them in much the same way as people have hypothesized for the Pine Island Glacier, where it's known that warmer warmer ocean water to wash in underneath the glacier, causing it to melt and thin and making it speed more ice towards the ocean.
Right.
So they're not suggesting that this has started to happen for the Moller ice stream yet, but they have found that the structures there are such that if warming does progress, then there could be a similar vulnerability on the other side of the West Antarctic ice sheet. A second paper, the one we just talked about was published in Nature Geoscience. Now, a second paper by a group from the Alfred Wegener Institute in Bremen in Germany. They looked at modeling of the Filchner-Ronne ice shelf, and they found that there could be significant warming in the Weddell Sea area in the near future. And when that happens, the sea ice, which normally hangs around in the Weddell Sea through summer, could well disappear or at least be greatly reduced. And you might then find that you get a warmer tongue of odor. If you just, there we are, Glenn's got them up on screen now. There's a couple of little maps that show, little graphs that show what happens. The warm water gets in under the ice sheet and can melt away the ice and reduce the kind of braking effect on ice flowing towards the ocean.
Kind of gouges it out in between the continental shelf and the ice, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely right. So the big red arrow, go down a bit, Glenn. Scroll down a bit.
Yep.
Oh, I can't see. Anyway, the big red arrow washes out the ice and pushes it into the sea a little bit faster, and that's exactly what was hypothesized happening and actually has been measured to be happening at the Pine Island Glacier. So between these two papers, you've got the discovery of a large sort of gap underneath, or a large potential gap underneath the ice in the Filchner-Ronne ice shelf in the Weddell Sea, and then you've got climate modeling predicting that warmer waters could begin to lap under that area later on in this century. So it's you're looking at a sort of a double whammy, if you like, but not something that's likely to happen in the very near future. They're talking about a chain reaction that could happen over, I think the phrase is the next 6 decades. So sometime this century, this could begin to happen.
But the sea level rise may not be as bad as some have been predicting, right?
Yeah, that's right. This is an interesting little paper that The Guardian reported on. And this was a group of researchers who looked at a big survey of Greenland glaciers. And this is the first one to look at an awful lot of glaciers together all at the same time. And they find that they aren't all speeding up as much as was thought possible. So the ice has still increased its rate of falling off Greenland. It's sped up by about 30% over the last decade. But what they've found is that some glaciers basically speed up and slow down, and not all of the glaciers are performing in the same way. So in other words, it's a more complicated picture than people had expected, and what we're observing is not the absolute worst case where everything speeds up all at once. So we know that Greenland is losing lots of ice. We know that the increasing, but this paper suggests that we may not be at the worst case. So that in itself is good news. But having said that, we are still discovering interesting stuff about the other end of the world, about West Antarctica, and potential added dangers in that area. So we're basically dealing with a fairly clear picture that melting's happening, but what we're not clear about is how fast, how soon. So very interesting. And just because we're talking about Greenland, how could we talk about Greenland and not mention our old friend Jason Box?
Very true.
Who, absolutely. And just as I was preparing for the show recording today, up pops on my face box is just posted today. It was about 20 minutes ago when I first saw it. This is his Operation Iceberg for his summer campaign, and they've installed, this picture shows the red helicopter. They've just installed 3 GPS monitors, a weather station, a tide gauge, and a time-lapse camera on the Store Glacier in West Greenland. Now, the Store Glacier is the second or third biggest in terms of the amount of ice that icebergs and so on that it chucks into the sea. So when if listeners and viewers may recall that when we talked planning a very busy summer in Greenland.
Yeah. He says on this one we're looking out of the helicopter.
A little while,
and he's
now, but beginning to get really stuck in on the work.
Yeah, he says the carving front where the icebergs begin their sea level contribution is more than an Eiffel Tower tall, and we've talked about that before, and the ice beneath the water level is up to 900 metres deep. So the scale of what we're looking at on those photos there on Facebook is huge.
It is absolutely mind that, you know, the above water section is as tall as the Eiffel Tower, and that means there's a huge amount underneath as well. And these things are just falling over and going out to sea. It's whether that's contributing to sea level rise or not, it's still the most awesome series of pictures that you can imagine, and one place that you can go to look at some absolutely staggering images. People that Jason works with, the Extreme Ice Survey. Now I'll put in the show notes, but there's lots of time-lapse shots of glaciers in Greenland and around the planet, how they're performing, how the icebergs are carving off the fronts, the ice is melting. They're stunning photography, absolutely stunning photography, the Extreme Ice Survey. So very much recommended that people should go along and have a look at that, particularly as we're now getting into the summer melt season in the Northern Hemisphere. And there are a number of wonderful ways you can look at that. Extreme Ice Survey site that's on screen at the moment includes Google Map imagery, but there is also the MODIS Arctic Mosaic, and I've mentioned this several times on the show over the years, but the Arctic Mosaic is basically a daily picture looking down from space on the whole of the Arctic, and it's already some large amounts of open water up there, particularly in the Beaufort Sea to the west of the Northwest Passage. So interesting times.
Extraordinary stuff. Time to welcome back John Cook onto the show from skepticalscience.com. Welcome back, John.
G'day, Glenn. Hey, Gareth.
How are you doing?
I'm good. It's nice, warm Queensland winter day. State of Origin's on tonight. It's the biggest day in the Queensland calendar, so I'm wearing Queensland maroon.
All right, say no more. This is when it's brother against brother or clubmate against clubmate, and they beat the hell out of each other.
It's mate against mate, state against state.
All right. Well, today's topic is all about the inappropriate use of graphs. Graphs being used in the wrong way, John.
Yeah. Well, specifically, I'm looking at the technique of cherry picking. So, on Skeptical Science, we talk about these 5 characteristics of climate denial, and the most popular method that we come up against is cherry picking, where people take just one piece of data that gives them the picture that they're looking for, and then ignores any other evidence that is their views. So Yeah. So what I wanted to look at it was I'm basically taking a guest article that a scientist, Mark Boslow, published on Skeptical Science over the last and he's looking at a specific instance of fairly overt cherry picking.
Okay. And what specifically?
Well, I guess if you want to understand cherry picking, the first thing to do is look at what is the full picture, and in this case, the full picture here is what we're talking about is temperatures over the last 1,000 years, and so hopefully I've got a graph here that this shows northern hemisphere temperatures over the last 1,000 years. So they take reconstructions from all over the northern hemisphere, and then take the average temperature over the whole hemisphere. And the key feature of this graph is that the warmest in the last 1,000 years.
So in other words, this is the northern hemisphere hockey stick graph.
Yeah. This is actually a number of different analyses. So it's not just the one hockey stick by Michael Mann. It actually takes a bunch of different studies done by different scientists using different methods, but all painting that consistent picture.
And so if climate scientists wanted to be really tricky and pull the wool over everyone's eyes in an extreme kind of way, they'd just take the data right there at the end, wouldn't they? The big hockey stick all the way up, but they don't. They include everything all the way back to 1000 AD.
Well, no, that's not actually the main way that that people try to mislead people about temperature over the last 1,000 years. I'll give you what I wanted to talk about today was a specific graph that often in newspapers or blogs. And if you can pop this up, this is a graph that appeared in a Wall Street Journal editorial. And this shows temperature over the last 3,000 years. And you can see that it's actually quite high over the last 3,000, bigger towards the right of the graph, which is modern times. And so the question is, why is this different to the first graph I showed you? Why is modern times not as warm?
Yeah.
And the answer is this is a graph of temperatures just at one single location at the Sargasso Sea. And this is actually taken from a 1996 paper by Lloyd Kaigwin, who took sediments from the Sargasso Sea and worked out temperatures going back 3,000 years. And at a single location, temperature acts quite a lot. And the way this is a bit like a baby in a bath. It's sloshing around. It's making the water jostle around a lot.
Yeah.
And if you measure the bath level at a single location, you'll see that it jumps up and down quite violently.
Yeah.
But if you average it out over the whole bath, the bath level stays quite level.
Sure.
And so what skeptics do in this case is it's like they're looking at one spot on the bath and saying, here, look, see how global temperatures changed so violently in the past, and yet they're only looking at one spot, not at the whole bath or the whole hemisphere. And so that graph was published in the Wall Street Journal in a couple of different editorials, and it was generally used to argue that global temperature's been much bigger in the past during the medieval warm period, and quite often over the last 3,000 years.
And now we see it represented in cartoon form as well.
Yeah, so then this cartoon was published in the Wall Street Journal, which takes the same graph, and it even portrays it as global temperatures if the writing comes up clear enough on YouTube. And I can guarantee you that a lot more people would have looked at this graph than would have read that 1996 paper by Lloyd Kaigwin.
Yeah.
So that's an example of misinformation getting out there, and people only getting one small part of the picture, but thinking that it was the full picture.
Okay. Anything to add to that, Gareth?
Well, I'm just thinking that apart from the cherry picking of taking a single source of data, which is
what they do when they look at Greenland temperature and pretend that it's a proxy for the world, for instance. The other thing, of course, is it's a really old paper. You know, we're talking about 1996. And so there's 16 years worth of work done since that graph was first put together. Not necessarily on temperatures in the Sargasso Sea, but you know, the amount of climate science that's been done since then is vast. And what we, you know, I'm sure John would agree with this, what we do when we look at the evidence is you have to look at it all. You don't pick a little bit of it, you have to look at it all. And that includes all of it in time, taking all the latest work into account, as well as just going back and finding a convenient bit of data from 16 years ago.
Yeah, that's, I mean, and a really good example of what Gareth is arguing is when you look at older IPCC reports and compare them to the newer reports. And I think it's the first assessment report by the IPCC show this temperature schematic, which is just from one location in England, and it shows a medieval warm period quite large. And then over the next couple of IPCC reports, they add in more and more data. They just do years and years of more climate science, and gradually they build that reconstruction of the whole hemisphere, not just a single location. And the medieval warm period becomes less prominent because it's only warm in certain locations. And skeptics develop these conspiracy theories saying they've disappeared the medieval warm period. But what they're actually doing is adding more data and building a more complete picture. And skeptics would rather go to that narrow, small picture back in the early 1990s when they only had that one location of data. But you need to use all the data that's available to us from all these different locations. But what you're showing there, Glenn, is just one other example of how this graph has been used to mislead. Now, the Heartland Institute published a report called, it was kind of like an anti-IPCC report. It was the non-governmental IPCC, I forget what the rest
of it non-governmental International Panel on Climate Change.
Yeah. And so they took this graph of the Sargasso Sea temperatures, and they gave it a title. What was that title called? I've lost it. Here we go. They called it the prehistoric temperatures from proxy data, and basically used the graph to argue that temperatures were much warmer back in medieval periods. So now is nothing unusual, therefore it must be natural. And although in the small print they did mention that this came from the Sargasso Sea temperature, still the broader argument they give in using this graph as part of their argument was that it was warmer over the past 1,000 years. And another thing they did was they put a little dot on there saying 2006 temperatures, and it was quite low. It was around the average over the last 3,000 years. But Mark Boslow got together with the guy Kygwin who first created that graph, and they worked out what actual 2006 temperatures were at that location. Yeah. And it was about 1 degree warmer than what the Heartland Institute was saying. And so this graph just shows where the actual 2006 temperatures were, and compared to how the Heartland Institute were portraying it. And Mark offered to attend the Heartland Institute's conference, which is on right now, actually. I think there's actually some live feed going on as we speak. Yeah. And offered to present this information just to help them correct their mistake in their report. But they declined to accept his offer.
Right.
Well, that's quite telling, isn't it, John? Because they make a great deal of play at Heartland about wanting to invite real scientists to their conferences and how they never turn up. Unfortunately, if you're going to go to the conference and give them an inconvenient message, it appears they don't want to know.
And especially when this was an analysis done by one of the actual scientists who created the graph that they were using in their report. So yeah, it's unfortunate.
Yes, well, not the IPCC project, which is how I've always referred to it at Hot Topic, is if we've been talking about cherry picking, the NIPCC is positively a bowl of cherries. It's a complete, it's a cabinet full of cherry pies.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was flicking through that section of their report earlier today, and I noticed that they would often show a graph of like a proxy graph of temperature over the last 1,000 years, and they'd just neglect to add the temperature record. So it was basically missing out the last 60 or 100 years of warming. So you know that's a fairly important bit of data to include in a temperature record.
Yes, they are quite literally living in the past. So we've got a special SKS URL for Sargasso, haven't we? So would you like me to read that out for you, John?
Yes, please. This is Mark's guest post, so it's a great article.
Yeah, I can recommend it too. Thoroughly recommend it as an exercise in how real scientists go about looking at data. So anyway, the URL is http://sks.to/Sargasso. That's SARGASSO.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Gareth. And of course, thanks very much, John, for once again righting the wrongs out there on the internet at skepticalscience.com.
No worries. And go Queensland tonight.
All right, and we're on to the final segment of the show, the solutions segment. Before we dive into those stories, I do want to thank our media partners for helping the show get out there and spreading the word. That is idealog.co.nz in the sustain section there. They like to feature the show, which is nice. Also at cyblogs.co.nz for advertising the show and also featuring it there as well. And that's a great site to go and see all the community of science bloggers from around New Zealand. And also livenews.co.nz via scoop.co.nz as well for featuring the show. Plus, also thanks very much to our technology partner Intel for providing the hub of the system that actually puts the show together, the motherboard and Intel Core i7 chip, which is a very powerful chip. Very good for gamers if you're into that sort of thing as well, but also very good for video production and audio production and I guess photography and that sort of things as well. It means you can multitask. You can do Skype while also crunching your video, while also tweeting out exactly what you're doing. You can do all these things at the same time on a computer system like this.
I think I should point out that the problems with my speech quality, sticky image, and blurry pictures are nothing whatsoever to do with an Intel Core i7 chip. They're everything to do with rubbish rural broadband.
Yes.
Or RRB, as we call it down here.
And that was well demonstrated as you were saying that, which is just perfect. Right, let's move on into the solutions. This is amazing, this thing. Now, it's called the EV Pioneer are planning to recruit some kind of drone electric plane. Explain this, it's amazing.
Yeah, this is a guy called Chip Yates. Now, Chip is best known for having been a pioneer of electric motorbikes. He made some incredibly fast electric motorbikes. And he's started a project. He wants to fly an electric aeroplane along the route that Charles Lindbergh took, who readers with long memories may recall that Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic. It was the first solo flight to go transatlantic in 1927. And he flew from roundabout New York to land near Paris, and Lindbergh's flight took a hell of a long time basically, and his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, is one of the most famous planes in the history of aviation. Yates wants to repeat the feat, but he wants to do it with an electric aeroplane. And the aeroplane, so you can see there on the screen now, his flight will take him up the east coast, up the northeast coast of the USA, over Newfoundland, and then across the Atlantic, popping down to the south of Ireland, across Cornwall, and dropping into Paris. And he plans to do this with a very special kind of electric aeroplane. He's calling his voyage the Flight of the Century, so you can go to flightofthecentury.com. The plane itself is, he's going to modify an existing plane, which is a Burt Rutan design. Now, Burt Rutan was or is the guy who designed the Virgin Galactic space tourism thing, which where a sort of great lumbering white plane takes a rocket up to
high altitude, the rocket fires and takes you up into the edges of space. So Rutan's a well-known aeronautical designer, and this particular design is called a long EZ, which is a very efficient fly, big wings basically, small body. But the big problem with electric aeroplanes, of course, is that they can only operate on battery power or on the solar cells that they might have on their surfaces.
Yeah.
And if you want to fly across the Atlantic, you're going to need an awful lot of battery power. And batteries are, if anything else, very heavy.
Yes.
Even the lightest ones are very, very heavy. So there is no way that you can have a plane that carries the weight, and would have to be enormous, I suppose, to enable you to fly on battery power all the way across the Atlantic. And what Yates has come up with is the idea that he has what you might call drone batteries. So if you flick on to the next page, both of these stories come from Wired, and I'll have the links up. But basically the idea is that each battery pack is a powered plane. And so Yates will take off from New York, fly up over the Newfoundland and drop one battery, which will fly back and land at a base. Another one comes up, docks with him, and then gives him the next lot of power until he's over, right over at St. John's, Newfoundland. And another battery will fly up and join him while the other one flies back. Right out over the middle, a battery will fly down from Iceland and meet him there. And similarly, the battery pack he leaves behind will fly back, and so on. He'll recharge again to the south of Ireland or to the southwest of Ireland, and then he'll be able to fly into Paris.
Okay.
Sorry.
Well, that's okay. So the technology is pretty cool. Like, you know, it's pretty amazing, these planes and these battery packs, and the fact that they can dock and everything. But there's something doesn't seem right about this, or it's just, you know, the aim is obviously to get from A to B on the power of one aircraft, right? But this kind of isn't that. I mean, it's aided, really, isn't it?
Well, it's like in-flight refueling. You know, when military planes fly around the world to deliver bombs to the other side of the planet. I mean, there were in Iraq and Iraq and Afghanistan. They had planes leaving from the US being refueled once or twice, running missions into Iraq.
True.
So, you know, it's not unheard of to do that with avgas-powered planes. What this is, this is just slightly different. The refueling is done with flying batteries. Now, obviously, this is going to get one man across the Atlantic if it works. It's not itself any sort of solution for electric-powered flight.
No.
But it does demonstrate that, and this is, I think, what Yates is on about. He's trying to push the boundaries in the same way that Lindbergh pushed the boundaries when he flew the Spirit of St. Louis. You know, the first people who flew across oceans in petrol-driven planes were taking very, very considerable risks, and they were really pushing hard at the boundaries of what the technology was capable of in their day. And so Yates's argument, I guess, is that by doing this, by pushing the limits of what electric aeroplanes are currently capable of, he hopes to be providing a stimulus to move the industry along, as it were, so that we can end up with truly useful electric airplanes that can do a little bit more than just sort of get up, fly around for an hour and have to land again.
So these things are obviously quite very light, and as you've been saying, they've got these big, large wings. I wonder what it would be like in stormy or just very windy conditions, because you know what it's like just on a normal passenger airliner with turbulence in certain sort of situations. I'd imagine these things would be thrown around quite a bit, wouldn't they?
Yeah, they're very big and light, and they've got big sort of bendy wings. So yes, I guess you're going to have to be much more careful about weather conditions and your choice of flight plan, as it were, to make sure that you don't expose yourself to difficult conditions. But I mean, that's true for other aircraft too.
True.
You know, if you're flying a big jumbo across the Atlantic, they will actually go and put themselves in the jet stream to reduce their fuel usage, taking advantage of the weather. But at the same time, they'll probably try and avoid big thunderheads over the equator, because we know that those can cause planes to catastrophically fail sometimes, as that Air France flight from South America to France did over the Atlantic a few years ago.
Well, good luck to him. When's he planning on doing it?
I'm not sure. 2014, I think. He's got it's a 3,600 mile trip. Yeah, and it's a fairly optimistic time frame. But yeah, he's known for his aggressive schedules.
No doubt.
I'd say.
Yeah. Okay. Finally, on to our last story. Solar-powered boat has finished a journey around the world.
Well, not quite the last story, but yes, the solar-powered boat story I just thought was a nice rounding off to the idea of crossing oceans in electric-powered vehicles. Solar-powered boats. This was a very large kind of catamaran-y type thing with solar panels all over the top, and it really did go all the way around the world. Set off on September the 27th of 2010, crossed the Atlantic, Pacific and Indian Oceans, went through the Panama and Suez canals, and it was called Planet Solar. It was lightweight, aerodynamic. Obviously, solar power for shipping is not quite as difficult to realize as it might be for an aircraft, because these things are floating on the water, first of all. The second thing, of course, is that ships can use wind in a way that aeroplanes can't. So whilst this particular solar-powered boat might not be setting any sort of precedent for future ocean transport options, it does demonstrate that solar technology is able to do a lot more than it might have done, say, even only 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, indeed. That's really, really nice. Like that. Okay, and finally, what was the last story?
Well, the final story is the secrets of the first practical artificial leaf, which is a difficult thing to say at the end of a long afternoon. Yeah, this is based on the work of Daniel Nocera, and I'm sure we've talked about this before on an earlier show, but the idea is basically that if you can come up with a device that will split water into hydrogen and oxygen just by putting a device into water and adding sunlight, then you've got a low-cost way of making hydrogen fuel. And Nocera's been working on this process for some time, and he's come up with a kind of catalyst which is much less expensive than platinum catalysts that have been used for this sort of thing before. And so the idea is that you put this, I'm going to struggle with this, but it's a nickel molybdenum zinc compound, and there's a cobalt film as well. And as light hits that, it generates oxygen and hydrogen. And that can be used to then fuel other things as well, whether it's a fuel cell or whatever. So I just thought that was interesting. He's getting the price down. These things are not yet available, but the technology is developing in a way that might well be, useful in a few years' time.
Pretty neat, isn't it? And I mean, if they do get it right and nut it out, I mean, it could be a real game changer. It's one of those sort of technologies, isn't it?
I think it is, yes. My own personal bet for a short-term game changer is solar photovoltaic, because the cells are very, very cheap at the moment, even though the US has recently announced it's going to put a tariff on cheap solar panels coming in from China. The fact is that the production technologies for these things now make the solar photovoltaics cheap. They're on the same sort of boom-bust development cycle as the computer industry with their chips and memory. They build a factory to make something, they make a bit of money at the beginning, and then the price falls as everybody else piles in. And this has been happening, boom bust is happening in solar photovoltaics. So that has a potential to be a game changer. You add in something like this sort of artificial leaf, which has applications off grids, perhaps in areas which have less kind of technology infrastructure, and you begin to find that solar power becomes relevant in many different parts of the world. So maybe this is the big step forward, not the next one, but the one after.
Indeed. Well, that wraps up this edition of The Climate Show, episode number 27, and the final one, I guess, for a little wee while I wait to get set up in London with a new studio sort of set up there, but I'm looking forward to getting back into it as soon as possible. We'll keep you updated, of course, with everything up at theclimateshow.com and hot-topic.co.nz, also the Facebook page, facebook.com/The Climate Show, and twitter.com/The Climate Show as well, and we'll try and make it as soon as possible, really. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And if there are people in the UK, particularly in London, who would like to welcome Glenn to their wonderful city and perhaps introduce him to some of the key players in climate world over there, then get in touch, please, because we will be a 3-continent show before too long.
Indeed, it's such a great opportunity to get in touch with scientists and researchers and anyone involved with thinking about climate change in that part of the world. Love to meet them in person and have them on the show in person as well, so it'll be great. Gareth, in the meantime, you take care and stay warm there in Waipara.
I'll do my best, and you make sure that the cat behaves itself while you're away.
Yeah, will do. Thanks very much, Gareth. See you next time.
Cheers, Glenn. Have a good trip.
What good is a drop in the ocean? What good is a drop in the ocean?